All right, we're kicking in here. We're on episode 3 of Why We Fight. If you've seen our previous episodes, you know that we kind of been going through this series, looking at what's going on, looking at how it's set up. We got to do our historical content notice right from the beginning. The following program contains authentic, unedited footage from World War II era. The material may include racial stereotypes, offensive depictions, and symbols of hate, including Nazi imagery, as well as wartime propaganda, which reflect the attitude and realities of the time. These films are presented as originally produced without alteration or censorship for the purpose of historical record, education, and discussion. Mission 4938 does not endorse the views, language, or depictions shown. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. So we're going to be kicking in over here. So what tonight's episode is about is the Germans going into France and getting into the fight there. And so we're going to go through some of these images. Let's go back to the start of the slide. So this is the France when Germany came into it. This top part in yellow was controlled out of Belgium. The French had taken over that area. And then it kind of shows you Alsace and Lorraine over here. This purple area was completely taken over by and annexed into Germany. The pink part was taken over at the start of the war. The white part was taken over near the end and kind of controlled by Italy and Germany. And this blue part over here was controlled by Italy. Paris falls, France doom, Britain next. This was a Chicago Daily News paper put out. You can kind of see some of the absolute panic that they have had. English prepares to fight alone. Total collapse of defense. There was a lot of panic that, oh Lord, France fell so quick because in World War I they didn't fall. And so them falling so quickly in the war was very terrifying to a lot of people. And then here's Germany marching into the Arc de Triomphe. And then, of course, Germany's leader Hitler could not stand to not take a picture in front of the Eiffel Tower like every 14-year-old tourist girl standing out there in front and getting that picture taken. So here's some pictures of the French resistance. The picture on the left, they are actually lining up to be shot and killed. These people knew that immediate capture meant they were going to die. And they continued to fight anyway, and they continued to fight all the way through the end of the war, fighting for French freedom. And they would run out onto the street, set up, shoot. They would get out. They would move people through. They would go through and send messages back to England. They were doing everything they could to get France to be free again. This next one is Charles de Gaulle marching back in through the Arc de Triomphe after they beat the Germans. And this was the German governor of France. And you can see on the first picture, that's him. On the second picture, he is riding in a motorcade being driven through France, and he is signing the surrender while in that motorcade. It was an absolute defeat and immediate parading him through the town after the German defeat. This right here is German women who were caught, or not German, I'm sorry. These were French women who were caught sleeping with German officers and German soldiers. And this was a common thing to see through France, was they would shave their heads bald. They would put a swastika on their forehead and march them through town as traitors to the French people. And this is how they kind of dealt with it at the end of the war. In fact, I think it was one of the mothers of one of the ABBA singers was this happened to them because they were Nazi collaborators. And then to finish it off there's the Americans parked in a Jeep out front looking up at the Eiffel Tower after it's been liberated from the Germans. We're going to get into this again. Heavy content warning. There's going to be a lot of Nazi imagery. We're going to be going through learning about the defeat of the Germans during a later episode. This whole series was created in 1943, 1942. We have some of the stuff from. It goes back. It has a lot of great footage. Again, this was shown not to the American citizenry at first. This was shown to those that were being drafted and volunteering into the war effort so they could learn why they are fighting in the war they're fighting. 1943, they were bringing people in, showing them these series of films, and later they were shown to the American people, but highly redacted. This is the first time in film history where they were putting together multiple scenes of wars and battles and putting it together into a way that made a cohesive story. The other thing that is very interesting about this, and they don't get enough credit, some of the archival footage from Germany, Japan, and Italy was smuggled out of those countries just to go so we could show this to the American service members as they were fighting in combat. So there was a lot of people that risk a lot to put this stuff together. And so we are going to jump into it. Why We Fight, Episode 3, Divide and Conquer. If you haven't seen, we're going to go and pause the other films. The first film really goes into explaining everything that happened before the war. Manchukuo, being taken over by the Japanese, Ethiopia being taken over by the Italians, and it kind of has that whole prelude to the war. The second one is them going into Poland and kicking the war off, and this is the last one, or not the last one, this is the third one, them going into Belgium, Holland, and taking over those countries. So that's where we're starting out here.
6 years of hard training and actual battle experience in Spain and Poland had made the German army look invincible. But what about the British and French? First, let's take up the British. They started from scratch, but both at home and abroad, an army was growing. For not only Britain had declared war, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the whole British Commonwealth of Nations was also determined on victory over Hitlerism and all it stands for. And Britain had one weapon that was ready, the Royal Navy. Shortly after war was declared, it had swept German shipping from the high seas. And units of the British fleet were deployed at Suez, Malta, Gibraltar, in the Channel, and in the North Sea, blockading Germany.
So again, we're going to pause real quick and give a little bit of history on that. So this is kind of how they beat Germany during World War I. By putting these blockades in place, they were actually starving the German people out during World War I this same way. Germany had wanted to open up the Mediterranean and bring in supplies that way, but the North Sea being blockaded and the English Channel being blockaded is how they beat them last time. So they immediately went back to those World War I tactics that had won them that war. And so they jumped straight in. It's not like, oh, they came up with this idea. This was already what they did during World War I, so that's why we're recapping that real quickly.
Conquest was impossible without running smack up against the rock called Britain. How to strike at that little island? That was the question. Between Britain and Germany stood not only France, but the little countries of Luxembourg, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The people of these small neutral countries were peaceful, hard-working, and free. They knew they were in the middle, and feared violation of their neutrality. Hitler knew this. He also knew that if they united with the Allies, they would form a solid democratic wall against Nazi aggression, and their conquest would be far more difficult. So before striking with his armies, he used another weapon, the propaganda barrage, to confuse, to make them lose faith, to divide and conquer. To lull the fears of the little neutrals, propaganda minister Goebbels told them Germany didn't want a war at all. It was Britain and France that caused all the trouble. Then it was Hitler's turn. In a speech on October 6, 1939, he made them all kinds of specific promises. To the Danes, he said, "We have concluded a non-aggression pact with Denmark." To the Norwegians, he said, "Germany never had any conflict with the northern states and has none today." To the Dutch, he said, "The new Reich has endeavored to continue the traditional friendship with Holland." And to the Belgians, he announced, "The Reich has put forth no claim which might in any way be regarded as a threat to Belgium." And while Hitler was making these promises, his generals were cold-bloodedly picking out the first victim, Norway. And why did they pick Norway? Its many steep inlets or fjords would make excellent U-boat bases, from which raiders could prey on British supply lines. Also, it would give the Nazis vital air bases. This is Scapa Flow, British naval base, and this the blockade fleet. At this time, the German-based bombers couldn't reach them. Possession of bases on Norway's western shore would bring these vital British defenses under easy bomber attack. But he couldn't take Norway without also taking tiny Denmark, the springboard for his attack. So at dawn on April 9th, 1940, the German army rolled across the neutral borders of Little Denmark, and in a matter of hours it occupied the entire country. By nightfall, Denmark is erased as a nation, and the Danes go into slavery. Although only 6 months before, Hitler had announced, "We have concluded a non-aggression pact with Denmark."
So we're going to point out so they had a non-aggression pact with Czechoslovakia. They had a non-aggression pact with Poland. They had a non-aggression pact with Austria. They had a non-aggression pact with the city of Dansk. So everywhere that you're seeing these non-aggression pacts pop up, it was very quickly after they signed them that they went to war. The only one right now that they have a non-aggression pact at this point, and what we're looking at that they've not violated, is their pact with Russia or the Soviet Union at the time to attack them.
The Danes will not forget. Meanwhile, in Norway, peaceful-looking German merchant ships like these had sneaked inside Norway's neutral waterway and tied up at all principal ports. That is, they looked like merchant ships. But if the Norwegians had had X-ray eyes, this is what they would have seen. The Trojan horse of ancient Greece brought up to date with new and deadlier weapons. At the precise moment that the Nazis overran Denmark, these quiet-looking ships sprang to life. At the same time, Nazi warships, discovered along the entire coastline, started steaming up the Norwegian fjords. Ships, transports, tanks, men, planes, all flung themselves simultaneously upon a defenseless country. Airborne infantry seized every strategic Norwegian airport. The whole job was made easier by treacherous fifth columnists, led by Major Quisling, who seized power and issued orders to suppress resistance. Nazi warships steamed past silent guns that could have blasted them out of the water. This was one of the most amazing acts of treachery the world has ever known. It brought Major Quisling international fame, making his very name synonymous with the word traitor.
And again, what a face that is. But that was something we saw from the last video is he was going through and trying to put these propped up leaders in England and the United States and Norway and Denmark and Austria. He was putting these propped up supporters and financing a lot of this in these countries so that way he wouldn't have a huge amount of resistance when they pushed into him. In fact, Austria welcomed him in as a hero because they had financed so much into Austria and put so much in there to prop up a stooge leader that was going to support him that they held a parade when he came in.
By the afternoon of April 9th, the Germans were in complete control of all 7 ports where they had landed in the morning. For the first time in more than 200 years, the people of Norway saw an invading army parading through their city. Many of these Nazi soldiers, strutting as conquerors in 1940, had last seen Norway some 20 years earlier, when, as refugee German children, they had been raised and cared for by kind Norwegians. Now these same Germans were back to repay that kindness with terror and destruction. Once they had occupied the capital, the Nazis quickly fanned out in all directions. But loyal Norwegian troops stopped one German column between Hamar and Elvera. So the Germans brought up their bombers. Norwegians were forced to flee to the north under constant and unopposed air attack. It was here that Captain Robert Losey, an American military attaché, was killed, the first American soldier to lose his life in this war. Meanwhile, the Nazis had spread all over the country. Small patrols occupied every strategic village. Parachute troops landed high in the mountains. Unopposed bombing raids sent defenseless civilians fleeing in stark terror. They hadn't wanted war. They had done everything to avoid it. Hoping they could escape the Nazi scourge, they had compromised and tragically failed to unite with the other democracies. And now they faced the scourge defenseless and alone. For before the Allies could come to their aid, the Germans were in control of all principal ports.
So this is where Norway kind of went to a different offensive, because we're seeing that they had no way of countering the bombings. So Norway's biggest defense broke down into small groups of snipers throughout all of Norway. And there's several famous ones. You can find a lot of information. There was a couple female snipers. There were several male snipers that spent most of the rest of the war taking out the German officers everywhere they could see them. If you were an officer, that was the main level of attack that they were going to do. And they were sniping distances that today, some of them still have pretty decent distance records and number counts of who they took out. And that's kind of where Norway switched their defense to, was just making sure their snipers were armed and out and trying to hide the snipers everywhere they could.
Regardless of this, British, French, and Polish contingents plunged in and made several landings along the Norwegian coast. They landed forces north and south of Trondheim and attempted an encircling movement on the city under constant, heavy, and almost entirely unopposed air attack. So the scene of action was out of range of British fighter planes. So they brought up aircraft carriers. But these are at a disadvantage when opposed by land-based planes. The Allies, therefore, were badly battered from the air. Finally, suffering heavy losses, they withdrew from a hopeless situation. Further to the north, at Narvik, they met with better success, inflicting heavy naval losses on the Nazis. Landings and held the town for nearly 2 months. Incidentally, they also took their first prisoners of the present war. Again, the Nazis' overwhelming air superiority proved a deciding factor. And the Allies were forced to withdraw under terrific air bombardment.
And again, these early engagements aren't really talked as much about in U.S. history. But going into Norway, it was so important that they tried to take as much as they can because it could cut off Germany from getting any kind of resources from the outside world, except for through Italy and up through Africa at this point, because they cut Gibraltar off so they couldn't go out and around. And the Suez Canal was an absolute wild battle area at this point. So if they can cut them off, and again, that's how they won World War I. If you can cut them off from being able to get oil and resources, you can starve them out, and they hope they could end the war early. And that's the reason Germany's also fighting so hard for Norway, is they need to break out from that whole shutdown of their economy.
Loyal Norwegians were left with their Quislings, their ruins, their dead. Even though 6 months before Hitler had said,
Germany never had any conflict with the northern states and has none today. The Norwegians will not forget.
And Hitler had another victory. He had hijacked 2 more countries. The world wondered and sometimes marveled at this man's efficiency. Gangster Dillinger was efficient too. When a man or a nation throws away all regard for the laws of God and man, he is bound at first to be more efficient than his victims. Society had a police force to deal with Gangster Dillinger, but it had no police force to deal with Gangster Hitler. So he clubbed Norway into submission and got what he wanted, bases for use against Britain. Now he had the northern claw of an enormous pincer movement. A drive through France would give him the southern claw. Blockade by U-boats coupled with mass bombing attacks would weaken the British for final invasion. Then, with Britain gone, Germany could reach out in all directions for world conquest. His next move must obviously be through France to get his southern claw. Through France. How was she to face the onslaught? These scenes are ancient history. They occurred in 1914. The German armies, without warning, had smashed across neutral Belgium, invaded France, reached the River Marne only a few miles from Paris. Out of the French capital poured the French reserves, riding out to battle the enemy in every vehicle that could move. The famous taxicab army. Note well, it was riding out to battle. In the center of the French line stood the 9th French Army, commanded by a then comparatively unknown general. On September 5th, 1914, he is reputed to have said, "My right is driven in. My center is giving way. The situation is excellent. I attack." Did attack. The German onslaught was checked, and Paris was saved. That comparatively unknown general later became commander-in-chief of all the Allied armies and presided at the signing of the armistice with the defeated Germans on November 11, 1918. To this general, the French people erected a monument. To Marshal Ferdinand Foch, whose motto was, "Attack, always attack."
Still later, the war-weary French people erected another monument. This one to a minister of war, André Maginot. Between the ideas symbolized by these two statues may well lie the military story of the fall of a great nation. In Foch's time, the proud spirit of France demanded nothing less than victory and placed its faith in the attack. In Maginot's time, the spirit, no longer proud, asked only to avoid defeat and placed its faith in concrete.
So we're going to address this real quick. So France fell very quickly during World War II. It wasn't because they were incapable. In fact, on paper, they were the strongest army in the world. The problem, however, is they were the strongest army in the world that was geared only to a trench warfare mindset. Trench warfare had scarred them as a people so badly that that's what they considered was going to be war from then on. So they had set everything up for trench warfare. They had lined knowing where, okay, the Germans will come this way and we'll have another trench warfare and we'll keep fighting and everything else. They were completely and wholly unprepared for a fast-moving and a quick line-changing war. And so France wasn't ready for what was coming after them with this really fast-paced war. And so it wasn't they collapsed in being weak. It was just this was a different type of warfare. Up until this point, this mechanized, quick-speed warfare was not a thing. And so Germany had used it very effectively in Poland, and you saw in Denmark, in Norway. Everyone had expected a war to come in a very slow-paced, okay, we're going to take a position, we're going to dig trenches, and then we'll be ready to defend it, and then we'll push from those trenches. Nobody had expected a war to come in a way that was, we're going to push, and we're going to push through fast. And in fact, in France, they hit the French, and then I believe they were through to the ocean in like 10 days. It was an incredibly quick speed. Yeah, they reached the coast in 10 days from when they hit. That's what caused the Dunkirk evacuation. And so this is just a completely different type of war than anyone in the world had seen up until this point. So it wasn't they were ineffective and they were a weak country. They, on paper, were at that time the strongest nation in the planet. They were just a nation geared towards trench warfare, and that was never coming back again.
So the French built the mighty chain of fortresses called the Maginot Line. These tremendous bastions were built deep into the French land. They were connected by underground passages and railways, guarding France's eastern borders facing Germany. And when France was finally forced to declare war against the rising Nazi menace, the French troops, instead of attacking, were marched into their modern caves to wait for the Nazi blitz to smash itself against the Maginot Line. And their generals, headed by Marshal Pétain, proudly announced, "Whoever makes the first move in this war will be hurt." But Hitler didn't go near the Maginot Line. That was France's strong point. Instead, he attacked the weak point. Hitler knew that the French had tried to avoid war instead of preparing for it. That knowledge was one of his greatest weapons. He knew they had planes, but he knew they were antiquated. He knew they had tanks, but he knew they were few in number and lightly armored. But most important of all, he knew that France had become a cynical and disillusioned nation. What made this change in the French spirit? In the first place, between 1914 and 1918, the French suffered more than 6 million casualties in the heroic defense of their land against German invasion. The flower of an entire generation was lost, with its stimulus of new blood, new determination, new ideals. Secondly, the failure of the League of Nations, to which the French had pinned their hopes of peace, the corruption of many in high places, the greed of special interests, all had combined to shake the faith of the French people in their democratic ideals. And when a people loses its faith in its own ideals, it is ripe for the insidious words of the devil. France still looked like an imposing castle, but Hitler's political termites had so gnawed away the binding of national unity that the castle was ready to crumble.
So that's what we were talking about. They had this whole wearing away of national unity, wearing away of the people inside. And again, that's something we talked about in the last several videos, and we've seen this as what the enemy uses. If you can get inside of a country, you can sow discontent and sow people hating their own country. If you can frame people as victims and that they are fine to attack who they're calling the oppressor and use their victim privilege, you can undermine an entire country and make it easier for invasion. And sometimes you don't even have to invade. Sometimes you can just have them overthrow themselves. And that's one of the things that Hitler and his group used very well. They had they helped fund riots within these countries and help them frame their own countries as the oppressors of them. And so that's why some of these countries also fell so desperately quickly.
During those months of military inactivity that we call the phony war, a ceaseless barrage of German propaganda crossed the still waters of the Rhine to affect the soldiers in the Maginot Line. "Why do you fight?" asked the banners. Poems and friendly notes were sent over by balloons. French tunes were played by German bands, and German hooey was broadcast in French. British will fight to the last drop of French blood. You have been deceived. This is an imperialistic war for Britain. We Germans want nothing of France. What is happening to your wives back home, soldiers? The British are stationed in your villages. Yes, France was ready to be plucked. The whole force of the Nazi might was turned toward the west. How would they strike this time? Through Alsace-Lorraine as in 1870? Through the Low Countries as in 1914? What was the 1940 model conquest? The French considered the Maginot Line utterly impregnable, and therefore believed the Germans would again try a swing through the Low Countries as in 1914. But even after Hitler's rape of Scandinavia, Holland and Belgium, hoping against hope, still clung to their neutrality. So the French massed 78 divisions here along the border of Belgium. 17 were in the Maginot Line. 10 divisions here in case Mussolini got bold. 3.5 as a safeguard against Spain. The British had 10 divisions here. The Allied strategy in the event of an attack against the Low Countries was to swing their armies like a gate into Belgium, the hinge being the north end of the Maginot Line.
So again, we're going to pause real quick, because one of the things that it showed on there, it didn't really hint, was you saw that one gap that no one was lining armies on. That was Switzerland. Switzerland had had its neutrality, very well publicly known. But one of the other things is, we talked about France being the #1 dominant military on paper at the time. Switzerland was the #1 dominant without being on paper. Because of the fortifications, the mountains, everything else, they were extremely well protected. They could blow any bridge in and out of Switzerland. They could collapse any tunnel. They had a very, very modern military. The universal conscription. They had everyone mobilized already. They could go at a moment's notice. There is no soft part of a target for Switzerland. The other thing that made it almost impossible to touch is nobody wanted to touch Switzerland's neutrality, because they also were very strategic in the point of anyone could trade, and their banking, anyone could trade that way as well. So if the French were being defeated, they wanted Switzerland to be up and going, because they could move their money and their reserves into Switzerland that way, so the Germans couldn't take it. But if the Germans were getting defeated, they could also move their stuff into Switzerland so nobody could take it. So Switzerland, everyone decided we're not touching them, because also the first person that would touch them, you're not going to take over their country, and you have the chance of them really doing some massive damage. And Switzerland throughout the war had done a couple things. They'd shot down German planes. They'd shot down American planes. They defended. It wasn't just neutrality. It was aggressive neutrality. And so when they're showing these lines of, oh, these countries are neutral, Belgium, yes, was neutral, but it wasn't neutral the same way that Switzerland was. Belgium was passively neutral. We weren't going to take sides. Switzerland was aggressively neutral. You are not going to make us take sides.
This all-important hinge was protected by the forest of the Ardennes, a hilly and thickly wooded area, honeycombed with streams, its roads narrow trails, its bridges too weak for military vehicles. French strategists estimated the forest of the Ardennes impassable for armored forces. As you will see, this was one of the costliest estimates in all military history. That was the situation on May 9, 1940. The hour of trial had come. The people of the democracies prayed for strength to meet the coming hurricane of terror. While across the Rhine,
Juden ist uns verschrieben und verfallen mit
a delirious madness possessed the German nation.
Nun als Dauererscheinung für uns, unser Oberster, wird die Einführung der allgemeinen immer wieder herniedersteigen. Und dass man die Wahrheit über Deutschland berichtet. 50.000 Mann auf den Baustellen, der ganz Deutschland erfasste. Überall herrscht seit einem Jahr Regen. Und für den deutschen die Reinheit seiner Rasse hält. Hitler aber ist Deutschland wie Deutschland. Deshalb innerlich nicht zu uns gehört.
Sieg! Der Tag had come. Without even bothering to declare war, the German armies launched a coordinated attack across the neutral borders of Luxembourg, Belgium, and Holland, from the Maginot Line north to the sea. The action along the entire front was simultaneous, so for purposes of clarity, let's take up one country at a time. First, let's see what happened in Holland. Nazi ground forces smashed through the improvised and hastily erected border defenses. But the main attack was to come from the air, far behind the defense lines.
So again, we're going to kind of look at something unique here. We're looking at the air warfare portion of this. You got to think World War One had started with people shooting at each other with service pistols from the planes, because the planes didn't have guns. And then eventually you had gunners who would be on there, and eventually they developed the interrupting gear where they could shoot from the plane itself. To the point here that they're adapting to parachute troops, they're adapting to bombers, they're adapting to all these new ways of attacking that had been tried out in like the Russo-Sino War, the Russo-Japanese War, some other conflicts, but they had learned and adapted. Whereas a lot of other countries were still trying to base off of World War One tactics and ways of doing things. And that seems to be a case, if you watch through history throughout the world, the person who adapts to the technology and adapts warfare in a way that's not seen typically wins. And we're seeing that today with drone attacks and things like that. And even somewhat switching over to looking at Vietnam, looking at some of the other ones. When you're switching over to, we're going to do hit and run tactics, we're going to do other tactics that are different than what the other countries were assuming was going to happen, and you fight a war in a different way and can put somebody off, you can win. And so that's what we're seeing here, is they're adapting to these paratrooper tactics, these fast moving, hey, we're going to push the tanks as far forward and as fast as we can and not allow them to set up trenches and things like that. So they're adapting all these techniques. And so that's why they're having such great success at this point.
Over 10,000 troops were landed in this manner. Before the stunned citizens of Rotterdam even knew they were at war, these troops, aided by well-trained fifth columnists, quickly captured the airport and outlying sections of the city. Meantime, Nazi armored columns were racing across the country, their progress speeded by other fifth columnists who prevented the destruction of vital dikes and bridges. These forces effected a meeting with the parachutists landed in Rotterdam. The Dutch were doomed to defeat. On the fourth day of the invasion, the Nazis gave the Dutch general an ultimatum. All Dutch resistance must cease, or Rotterdam will be bombed flat. The Dutch general had little choice. To save the lives of innocent civilians, he accepted the German terms. But after the unconditional surrender, the Nazis bombed the city anyway. Flights of unopposed German bombers flew low over the center of Rotterdam and methodically bombed it into a heap of rubble.
We're again seeing forced to compliance, promise something, attack. And that's what they've done over and over and over again. And unfortunately, the world was learning very slowly that, hey, look, we can't take them on their word. You would have thought that they would have picked up on that very quickly, but it is definitely the story that's told over and over again during World War II. They promise something, they don't deliver on it. They promise something and they do the opposite of what they promised. And so this is kind of a unfortunate thing where people weren't learning their lesson. But you can see when the U.S. actually entered the war, we kind of learned some lessons on this. Hey, let's drop paratroopers behind the lines that they're expecting. Let's drop equipment in behind where they're expecting. And so their tactics kind of got used against them by the end of the war on this. But this is just, again, their initial invasion, their initial push in to taking over Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and France.
One of the most ruthless exhibitions of savagery the world has ever seen. Over 30,000 men, women, and children were killed in the space of 90 minutes. Though only 6 months before, Hitler had said, the new Reich has endeavored to continue the traditional friendship with Holland. The Dutch will not forget. Meantime, in Belgium, the whole force of Nazi blitzkrieg had stormed across its neutral borders. The main German attack was directed at the Albert Canal-Meuse River line, the anchor of which was Fort Ibanemayo, a modern and seemingly impregnable fortress. The Germans had secretly built a replica of the mighty fortress in Czechoslovakia and had rehearsed the attack until they knew every detail of the fort's construction and its every weakness. When the real attack came, it was foolproof. Parachute troops, dive bombers, flamethrowers, specially trained engineer battalions, all working together as a well-trained team. They knew exactly where to cross the river. that this assault engineer knows exactly where to put his high explosive charge in order to destroy the blockhouse. Fort Eben-Emael withstood the Nazi attack exactly 2 days, and the German armies rolled on. Meantime, an hour and a half after the German invasion began, Allied troops crossed the French and Belgian border to meet the advancing Germans. As they raced across Belgium to take up their defense positions, they met an obstacle they hadn't counted on. Refugees. And the refugee-choked roads didn't get that way by accident. The Nazis methodically bombed little towns and villages, otherwise devoid of any military value, not so much to kill as to drive the inhabitants out onto the highway. Then, by expert machine gunning, the Nazis would herd them along in terror-stricken flight to hopelessly entangle the advancing Allied armies. Refugees used as a weapon of war, a new low in inhumanity.
We'll give a pause real quick. Thank you, Hank Williams fan, for subscribing. We really do appreciate it. So as we're looking at this again, this is kind of explaining why they were so quick moving through Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, and into France. This was such a revolutionary way to fight war. And so, again, France gets a lot of grief for how quickly they surrendered in this. But as we're looking at this, again, people are sneaking this footage out to get to the U.S. because if you're getting drafted into a war and you're not understanding why you're fighting it and why you're going up against them, being able to see this and kind of get the context of what's going on and understanding everything that preluded to you coming into the fight kind of gives you a better understanding. Hey, we have to win this. And that's how it's being framed in this. And again, I completely think it's everything we did to fight this war is justified, but this is kind of a propaganda. We're going to show it to our troops. We're going to get them to understand why we're fighting and kind of frame everything up. There's the good side and the bad side because it makes it easier to get them to fight. And so this isn't something that's shown as much today. I know at least when I was in, you wouldn't have them framing stuff up this way when we were going to Iraq, Afghanistan, any of those places. But it kind of gives you the history of the conflict. And it really is such a unique perspective, and it's ahead of its time how it was made at this point.
No school today, the sign says. The children are otherwise occupied. Hitler had announced.
Sorry, we're going to jump ahead a little bit. Not saying that I want to censor anything, but I can't watch too many of the kids in the hospital crying. That's breaks into my soul just a little bit there. So what we jumped ahead of is they were showing how many children were being affected because they were straight bombing schools and churches and places like that, and we're just doing absolute devastation to the civilian population and taking out any will their people had to fight or resist. And it really did break down Luxembourg quite devastatingly to have just watching their populations just be demolished in such a cruel way that they didn't really have a will to fight anymore, just give up so they stop hitting us.
The Reich has put forth no claim which might in any way be regarded as a threat to Belgium. The Belgians will not forget. And what about the Allies? They were convinced that the German attack on Belgium and Holland was the main thrust, and according to plan, had swung their armies like a gate into Belgium. But the attack on Belgium and Holland was only a feint. The main German attack was to be centered where the Allies least expected it, through the Ardennes forest. For this decisive blow, they had secretly assembled the mightiest striking force the world had ever seen, including 45,000 armored vehicles.
At the same time that the Nazi armies were plunging into Holland and Belgium, this column started to move. Well-trained engineer battalions went first. They were opposed only by scattered Allied patrols. They cleared pathways for the tanks to follow. In 3 days, the German armored force reached the Meuse River, 2 days faster than the French thought any troops could get through. By all rules, the Germans should have paused here to bring up heavy artillery before attempting to force the river. But the Nazis had a new type of artillery, dive bombers. With them, they blasted the French positions across the Meuse. With feverish haste, the Germans laid a barrage across the river with anything and everything that would shoot.
tremendous concentration of firepower continued all through the night. By the following day, shock troops were able to get across the river. These shock troops held the bridgehead until the engineers brought up pontons and built bridges. Then, without wasting a moment, across these bridges, the main armored force of the German military machine rolled through the Sedan for the all-important breakthrough into a dismayed and flat-footed France. There went the old ball game for the Allies. From here on, it was only a matter of how long. Watch the map as one of our intelligence officers explains the details of the German breakthrough.
We speak of the breakthrough at Sedan, but actually the break was along a wide front extending for 50 miles from Namur in Belgium to Sedan. Further north, the Allied armies had swung like a gate into these positions. The German armies had swept over Holland, broken the line of the Albert Canal, and for all anyone knew, were preparing to smash against the Allied front with all their power. That was the situation, dangerous but obscure, on the evening of May 13th. On the 14th and 15th, it became clear that the German breakthrough south of Namur was in the greatest strength, and that the French Ninth Army, attacked while moving into position, had been shattered. Without doubt, this was the point of mortal danger, and the French High Command ordered the abandonment of these positions, although they had not yet been attacked. Those positions were abandoned solely because of the situation developing along the Meuse near Sedan. In the meantime, the French 7th Army had been ordered to make its historic forced march far to the south into the area threatened by the rapidly advancing German spearheads. This army was not used to attack the German flank, but rather was used as a plug to restore the broken front. Throughout, the Allies had placed their faith not in offense, but in defense, and the defense was doomed to failure because it was confronted with an entirely new technique in warfare, the plain tank infantry team in action. The world was staggered by the speed with which the German armored columns moved. What was the secret that enabled armies to move so far so rapidly? The secret lay in the organization of the striking spearhead. Armored forces came first, closely followed by motorized divisions, which peeled off, forming solid walls. And through the corridor thus formed, raced the supply trucks to feed the ever-lengthening column. It was obvious that if the Allied situation was to be restored, the German column would have to be cut. On May 17th, General de Gaulle attacked the German flank and captured a few prisoners. But his light mechanized forces were like a pin pricking the side of a rhinoceros. A subsequent attack met with even less success. The means for a really successful counterattack against the German corridor simply did not exist. Where numbers of divisions were required, only handfuls of companies and battalions were available. A valiant attempt to cut the German corridor was made by a group of slow-moving British tanks just south of Arras. But lack of sustained striking power doomed this valiant unit to destruction. On May 21st, the German spearhead reached the channel port of Abbeville. Protecting their flank along the Somme, the Germans fanned out to the north and east. This was to be the perfect battle of annihilation. On May 28th, the Belgian army, compressed into a small space and weary of battle, laid down its arms. That left the desperate French and British defenders with their backs to the sea at the small channel port of Dunkirk.
One of the great
Okay, so for those of you who didn't capture what that very monotone man was saying, this was a different type of warfare. The French had slow-moving tanks that were heavily armored and fast-moving tanks that were extremely lightly armored. The Germans had decided their form of battle was going to be cohesive attacks. We're going to have tanks that are heavier and that have bigger motors and can move faster and move bigger armor and bigger guns forward. They also were going to do that in collaboration with having aircraft and bombers overhead and having their infantry plug any holes there may be. Whereas the French were looking at it still from another aspect of, we will have our soldiers move forward and the tanks plug those holes, and have the light tanks try to do lightning strikes in there and hit. Well, warfare had changed in that 20 years since World War I was over, and Germany had realized it. So they had a brand new mechanized army that was prepared for the type of warfare they wanted to engage in, and they built around that. Whereas everyone else was still having those thoughts of, okay, well, we can have slow-moving, heavy fire tanks because trench warfare is the new way of battle. Then our airplanes will come in afterwards and hit the enemy trenches. Well, when you change everything and you say, okay, while we're attacking, we'll have planes going over the head of the enemy and dropping bombs on them, and we'll push real hard with tanks into them at the same time, it changes everything. Your way of fighting is completely different than it's ever been, and you have to figure out on the fly. Charles de Gaulle was doing his best to figure it out. Okay, we need to cut them off where we can, push our light tanks in here, try to cut them off and make it where they can't resupply with fuel. And that's what his main goal was, is cut them off from fuel. If we cut them off from fuel, they can't drive these tanks forever. They're eventually going to run out. But he was getting some different direction from the French leadership, and they didn't see things the same way he was seeing them. And so it was capture some and then let them take their spot back, capture and take their spot back. Well, if you're capturing and then letting that opening get back in, fuel's going to flow back forward to the front. They can refuel their tanks and keep pushing. And so this was just such a wildly different expectation of warfare.
The greatest disasters in history seemed in the making. An entire British army faced annihilation. But out of the fog and the mist shrouding the channel came a strange armada of Navy craft, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, anything that would float. The seagoing people of Britain had come to rescue their army. High overhead, British fighter planes fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill. Below, small Allied suicide units held the Germans back long enough for the miracle of Dunkirk to take place. $211,500 British troops, plus 112,500 French and Belgian, were rescued. Over 300,000 battle-tested men, grimly determined to go back again with new tools, new weapons with which to blast the hated Nazis out of this world. For free men are like rubber balls. The harder they fall, the higher they bounce. Leading the British by this time was a man who had been bouncing all his life, Winston Churchill, who had tried for years to warn the world about Germany. Meantime, the situation that faced France was as nearly hopeless as a military situation can be. 2/5 of the French army was lost. There were fewer than 50 divisions left to defend a front almost 200 miles long, running from the northern end of the Maginot Line to the sea. And behind that thin front line, there were no reserves. The despairing people of Paris sent their children south, praying that some miracle would keep them from harm. The hopeless men of the French army, without adequate arms or equipment, braced themselves for the coming blow.
The first blow fell on June 5th. The French resistance was determined, but by June 8th, the left flank army had been shattered, and a general withdrawal was ordered to the line of the Marne and the Seine. On June 9th, the German main attack came. Within 2 days, the German armored and motorized divisions roared out into the open terrain. With this breakthrough, the issue of the Battle of France was decided, and from that time on, there was official talk of an armistice. Now, what about the famous Maginot Line? Let's go back and take a look. On June 14th, the Germans launched 2 attacks against the Maginot Line. In both cases, penetrations were effected. But we must remember that this was against fortifications defended by men devoid of hope.
In the meantime, Mussolini, now thinking it's safe, sent his division racing across the border.
The hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
Organized resistance in France was no longer possible. The government faced 2 alternatives: retire to North Africa and carry on from there, or give up the struggle. France's leaders were old and tired, and the oldest and most tired was Marshal Pétain. Egged on by men like Laval, who saw in a German victory his chance for personal power, on June 16th, Pétain asked for an armistice. The news is carried to Hitler, who received this word of a great nation's fall in a characteristic manner. Also characteristic were his terms for the armistice. It must be signed in the coach where Marshal Foch met the defeated Germans in the last war. The French delegation arrived to pay the final price of French disunity and the treachery of some of its leaders. The final price, a price that for centuries to come, the French won't forget. More than 3/5 of their country was to be blacked out by a military occupation. The remainder was to be controlled by a French government acceptable to Hitler. A tax of 400 million francs a day was to be imposed on the French people to support the German army of occupation. Nearly 2 million French prisoners of war were to be taken into Germany and kept there as hostages, to work as slaves or rot of hunger, tuberculosis, or other diseases in concentration camps. Men deliberately and permanently separated from their families in order to decrease the French birth rate and thus eliminate France as a world power in future generations. French civilians, men, women, and children, must slave on farm or in factory for the Nazi master race or starve. There will be a class of subject alien races. We need not hesitate to call them slaves. French children were to grow up on such inadequate food that many would reach the age of 12 before they grew new teeth. And for any attempts to protest against these restrictions, thousands of innocent French civilians would be executed. This was the price the French were to pay as they signed the armistice. And the master of the master race must go to Paris to tour the streets of what was once the city of light. You notice no cheering crowds here to welcome in the new order. When the people of Paris come to the streets again, it is to hear the voice of dictators telling them what they must do, how they must live, what they must say, what they must think, telling them how to be slaves. Gone is the Republic of France. Gone is free speech and a free representative government. Gone is liberty, equality, fraternity. These are the French. With their ears, they listen. But their minds and their hearts, these are down on the Mediterranean, where the battle colors of the regiments are being taken to Africa, out of the Nazi grasp. The people weep as their glory departs, for they don't as yet know that France has hope, a rallying point. Charles de Gaulle, a soldier in the great tradition of Foch, is not surrendering. He will continue to fight, gathering about him loyal Frenchmen from all over the world to become the Free French Army, the fighting French. Yes, the people weep as they watch their colors go, not knowing that 2 years later, those same flags would again be unfurled in North Africa, alongside the Stars and Stripes, alongside the Union Jack. Once more, their leaders, General de Gaulle and the famous General Giraud, stand united in the common cause with the leaders of their allies. Once more, the red, white, and blue of France is raised on high. For out of the ashes of the defeat and the humiliation of France, her soul has been born again.
Alrighty, so what you saw there is Italy got a swoop in there at the very end to help take over France. And that was kind of done in repayment for Italy going into Ethiopia first. Because again, Hitler wanted to use Italy to kind of see how much fight the League of Nations had in them to oppose countries going to war. And so Italy was always kind of trying to take the putz or the lackey role to Germany. I know they had a plan of making the Mediterranean the Italian private lake, but he really did kind of fall into the pawn of whatever Hitler said he did. And so you saw there Charles de Gaulle and a big portion of the French government who did not want to surrender loaded up as much as they could. And as the Germans were signing peace treaties with those that wanted to surrender in the French government, he was getting as many as he could to go into North Africa, go down into Casablanca, go down to Morocco, head down into those areas and try to regroup and get some kind of a battle force and a fighting force together. And again, America wasn't in the war yet, so a lot of Americans answered the call of the French Free Army and went to Africa to help fight, or answered the call of the British Army, especially after Dunkirk, and said, hey, look, we want to be in this war. We want to fight. We're seeing what's going on. We can't allow the world to fall into this kind of chaos of the National Socialism and the fascism of Italy. So we're going to jump in and get involved in the war. And after America entered the war, the French Free Army released all of their Americans that were fighting for them and sent them to go fight with the Americans. And so did the British. So this is the first time of hey, we're going to be a country in exile. And Ethiopia, I can't say it's the first time, Ethiopia was doing the same thing. Their king was still alive and had taken a great group of his fighting troops and went out into the middle of the wilderness and said, look, they may take over our capital and take over our country, but they're not going to get us and keep us down forever. We're eventually going to rise back up. So that's where we're kind of leaving off for this evening. I know we'll be back tomorrow with some more Fallout. Again, kind of some of the same propaganda kind of things we're seeing, some of the same kind of ideas behind some of the propaganda we'll be seeing tomorrow. The next one we'll have of these will be the Battle of Britain. And that will be on Tuesday. We're moving things up. We're going to move them up to about 8 p.m. Central Time. We'd love to see you back. And I think tomorrow we'll be live at 11:30 Central Time with some more Fallout. But we'll keep going on this series. We have the Battle of Britain coming up on Tuesday. And then I think the next one is the Battle of Russia. And then Battle of China. And then the last one is War Comes to America. So keep in mind, we'll be continuing this on, and be sure to join us tomorrow, 11:30 Central Standard Time, 11:30 a.m. Central Standard Time. We have a great time over on the Fallout Friday with Recon Sarge, so you won't be hearing my voice, but you'll see me over in the stream chatting. Recon's going to lead us through a really great time on that. And until then, as always, stay strong, stay true, stay Frankie. We'll see you in the next one.
And now, our national anthem.